Hello, my name is Maartje van Eerd. In this video we are going to talk about international housing rights and why they are important. Why, would you ask, do we need to know about housing rights? Housing rights deal with obligations of states towards individuals. It is very important that citizens as well as policymakers are aware that housing is a right. That governments have the duty to do everything within their means to progressively realize that right. And citizens have the right to seek redress from courts of law for violation of their right to adequate housing. So, what is the context and the urgency of these housing rights now? Inadequate housing conditions and the unaffordability of housing are not new phenomena, but the issue of affordability has developed itself into a global urban housing crisis. This crisis is characterized by unresponsive housing supply, scarcity of affordable housing, and the proliferation and persistence of precarious dwellings in rapidly urbanizing low and middle-income countries. While most of the world's population lives in some sort of dwelling, around half live in conditions that are not considered adequate, and the percentage of urban population living in informal settlements has grown during recent decades. The context of the housing situation today is alarming in the sense that homelessness is on the rise. Many cities have become increasingly segregated, undermining equal access to adequate housing. Housing has increasingly become a tool for investments, while on the other hand, people in many cities struggle to get access to housing. Large-scale development projects, riverfront development projects, and all sorts of other environmental and climate change mitigation measures are increasingly leading to forced evictions and displacement. Insecure tenure remains a problem that puts people at risk and prone to forced evictions. And conflict and disaster and natural hazard-induced displacement and forced evictions have sharply increased over the past years. There are several human rights declarations that recognize the right to adequate housing. Key international declarations being the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966, and the Istanbul Declaration on Human Settlements of 1996. The right to housing was already incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Adequacy in relation to housing was first mentioned in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966, which says, "The state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions." Article 2 provides for the progressive realization of economic, social and cultural rights. The progressive realization in this context means that governments, within their capacities, are required to demonstrate that they are taking steps to the maximum of their available resources to realize that right. Then the right to adequate housing was addressed in General Comment 4 and General Comment 7 of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which were adopted by the UN Committee in 1991 and 1997 respectively. Adequacy, as defined in General Comment number 4, includes security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location and cultural adequacy. The right to housing implies that the state has a duty to facilitate access to housing for all. To that extent, human rights make housing a public good. As said, that does not necessarily mean that states have an obligation to provide housing. Most people must find their own way to obtain and secure their preferred place to live. As with other human rights, state obligations under the right to housing are a combination of passive and active duties, such as to respect the housing found by people themselves by abstaining from forced evictions and displacements, to protect the tenure of existing housing, to facilitate the opportunity of everyone to find affordable housing, and to provide necessary housing when vulnerable groups cannot manage to do so themselves. Governments are obligated to demonstrate that the measures they take are sufficient to realize the right for every individual in the shortest time possible in accordance with the maximum of available resources. Therefore, governments clearly should not evict people from their homes and land without due process. The protection against forced evictions is guaranteed in several international frameworks. So let us now have a closer look into the issue of forced evictions and how this relates to the overall topic of housing as a human right. The UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in 1997 defined forced evictions as the permanent or temporary removal against their will of individuals, families and/or communities from the homes and/or the land which they occupy, without the provision of and access to appropriate forms of legal or other protection. From 2000 onwards, the UN Human Rights Council appointed a special rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, who developed operational guidelines for states on forced evictions. These basic principles and guidelines on development-based evictions and displacement were formally acknowledged by the Human Rights Council in 2007. The basic principles define the practice of forced evictions and lay down stringent criteria outlining when they are allowed to occur, under which circumstances, and how the impact should be monitored. They establish the right to be resettled, and they also call upon states to guarantee the right to adequate housing for displaced communities living in adverse conditions. Meaning that resettlement sites must fulfill the criteria for adequate housing. To what extent those criteria are met is highly questionable, as research continues to show. According to the basic principles, after evictions have taken place and communities are resettled, local authorities should continue to play an important role in ensuring that relocation and any housing provided complies with domestic and international human rights standards. They must examine whether evicted people are able to access other human rights because of the eviction or relocation, including access to education for children, work and healthcare. In cases children are involved, local authorities must, along with social services and childcare services, regularly monitor their living conditions, as well as issues concerning general progress. Affected communities must also be provided with information on mechanisms whereby they could make complaints or raise concerns relating to the alternative housing provided. and they must be provided with access to a liaison officer and an ombudsperson in cases of grievances or complaints. In reality, resettlement is often not happening in accordance with those international standards, with many negative consequences for those being resettled. Problematic in many cases are the locational aspects of resettlement sites in relation to work, which challenges the validity of resettlement schemes and projects, with women often being worse affected than men. People are often moved in while the site is not yet fully developed, with the communities being excluded from the decision-making and design of the housing option offered. The design of public space is often specifically unsafe for women and girls, and the sites are often isolated and far from essential services like healthcare facilities and markets. So in conclusion, I would like to stress that everyone has the right to adequate housing and the right to be safe and secure where they live. This is incorporated in various international covenants and declarations. And secondly, governments are responsible to respect, to protect, to facilitate, and in some cases even provide affordable housing.